Yeah, I think we'll get started if that's all right. Well, thank you all for coming along this afternoon. It's wonderful for us to be here. We've possibly come the furthest distance, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, I'm Anthony Lee, this is my colleague Janel from Tain. You may have guessed we're from the Treasure Trove unit, so based in Edinburgh at National Museum Scotland. We're currently embarking on something of a grand tour through the Western Highlands and the Western Isles to try and get in as much as we can, see as many museums, meet as many people as we can going through. So it is a huge pleasure to be here.
Oh yes, we like to think we brought that with us.
It's absolutely us. Yeah, we'll go as soon as we go.
We're leaving on Monday, so enjoy it.
All the us. But yeah, what we'd just like to do this afternoon is just talk a bit through Treasure Trove, what it is. Some of you may have a very good idea what it is, some maybe not so much. So introduce the whole idea of Treasure Trove, the history of the scheme, where we are now, where we might be going. And then talk you through some of the goodies, some of the star finds from across Scotland, and particularly some amazing things that have been found in the Western Isles. So without further ado, I will do the first part before handing over to Janel. So the first and most fundamental question, what is Treasure Trove? A question we do sometimes ask ourselves. The idea of treasure is actually a really interesting one in archaeology. How do we define treasure? How do we get to this concept of what are the most valuable parts of our cultural heritage, particularly the material parts of it? So it's a complicated word in many ways. It's not a helpful word in a lot of ways because it carries connotations of shiny jewels and gold and silver. And indeed, for many, many years, at least since 1996, in the English and Welsh Treasure Act, gold and silver, precious metal content, has been the definition primarily of treasure. In Scotland, the legal situation is different, and the primary driver of what counts as treasure trove is the ownership situation. Items that are bona vacantia, they are ownerless goods, which for archaeological objects that have lain in the ground for many hundreds or thousands of years, quite clearly we can't trace back their original owners. The system basically of common law is that the ownerless property would default to the Crown. The Crown has the right to claim any ownerless property, and in Scotland it's the King's and Lord Treasurer's Remembrancer that is the representative that deals with it. So ultimately the person that we're responsible to. It's not a great name when you've had a couple of drinks on a Friday night. Who you work for, the name could be helpful.
It is a great job title.
Yeah, very jealous of his job titles. He's a solicitor really, yeah. But no, that's kind of how we fit into that bigger system. More important on the ground or on a daily basis is what counts our treasure trove under that definition. Firstly, the idea that it has to be something man-made. Natural objects don't count as treasure trove. So that means nothing that's a fossil, human bone, animal bone, don't intrinsically count as treasure trove and aren't in our purview. Those items that are found with human-made objects, though, do count as treasure. So an assemblage of animal bone isn't currently treasure trove. As soon as there's a little stone tool found in the centre of them, then by association everything can count as treasure trove. As I mentioned, things that are previously owned but whose owner now can't be traced, and perhaps just as importantly, they've been found in Scotland. Doesn't matter where they've been made, doesn't matter what journeys they might have been on in the interim, the point is that the moment of discovery is on Scottish soil or perhaps Scottish water for some instances. The idea of treasure trove is a long one. It is a common law. It does have its roots in the Middle Ages. You might not be too surprised that the idea the king can claim things that aren't his is a medieval idea. We have, for example, the nice little quote here, 1278, where Adam the Hoer found 21 pieces of old money unknown in the fields of Sowerby within the King of Scotland's liberty, which were delivered to the justice of their lord, the King Alexander III, whereon the steward of Scotland claimed the treasures for his lord's use. The system now works on a system where there is an ex gratia payment made to finders, so a reward payment for finding something and reporting it to the authorities. That also does have a medieval parallel as well. The note here in 1496, a reward of 24 shillings given to the fellow that found the hoard to buy him a cow. Quite generous, I think. It's nice to know what he did with it as well. So yeah, the principles that we work on, to say, are very, very long-rooted and have a long tradition in common law principles. In more recent times, 1808 is very much when we track back the idea of treasure trove becoming a more formal thing, kind of recognised, moving on from the medieval law into something a little bit more codified. The first find coming from the Western Isles, 1856, so we see that process starting to take shape. It takes some time to get through, and it's fair to say in the early 1800s, even though it's become more formalised, it's still a little bit random and a bit slapdash. We start to see as the 20th century moves on, an increased focus on the local allocation of fines, the idea, a principle that things should go back to the communities in which they were found and maybe originally belonged in, which is a principle that still holds good today. But it was the mid-1990s that some of the very modern structures were put into place. The English and Welsh Treasure Act came into place in 1996, and the changes in Scotland kind of reflect that idea of, even though the laws are different, thinking about how we manage treasure, how do we report fines, how do we record fines, how do we deal with the vast numbers of objects that are coming up, particularly in the mid-1990s, things like metal detecting are becoming increasingly popular. So that's sort of, as I say, the process has been more formalised, documentation theoretically getting better, and this idea of local museum allocation continuing. That's been very much the situation until very recently, and you see at the bottom there, 2023-24, we are currently undergoing a review, a kind of a root and branch independent review of the Treasure Trove process. Our colleague Sarah at the back here is one of the review team, and we will be very glad to talk to you about how you can get involved in giving your opinions across, as the idea of the review, we'll come back to at the end, but is about putting the whole system on a new footing for the next X number of decades, and making sure it's fit for purpose in the modern age. So the unit as it stands today is a unit of 6 people. This is larger than it's ever been. Historically it's been 2 people for many, many years, covering the whole of Scotland, which I can imagine is not always the easiest. But at the moment we are a team of 6, and we hope to remain at least a team of that size going forward into the future. But you can see Emily there gets a gold banner because she's our manager. Anything to keep her happy. And then a team of 5 of us officers. We divide up the country between us, which sounds very imperatorial. But no, in terms of just being able to get to know certain local areas, work with the museums and the finders. So particularly important here, Janel is up here because Janel looks after all the finds and things from the Western Isles. So she is very much the person to contact with anything you found, or any queries about the system that you have. But yeah, we try and divide things up, although we do have our own research specialisms as well. So when certain finds of certain date or nature come up, we like to think as a team we can usually work out what things are, or we have contacts and know somebody who does. The broad, quick overview of kind of how the TT process works is probably just useful to go through. So something's found, what then happens to it? First thing, of course, is it gets declared to us, but that's been brought in person. It could be by email, it could be through a finds day where we're out visiting a museum. Often finds are left and deposited on our behalf with local museums. A lot of museums very kindly take in objects for us, which obviously is invaluable because of the distances involved. That then goes into our systems. We research the object, we record the object. We then make a fundamental decision whether that find is going to be claimed or not. So if we determine that the Crown is going to claim the find, it will then go forward to the SAFAP panel, which is the Scottish Archaeological Finds Allocation Panel. So you can get KLTR and you can get SAFAP from it, you've got the whole of Treasure Trove sorted out in your mind. But that is an independent panel that sits separate to us, made up of various bodies and critical friends of the system. So everything that we determine should be declared and claimed treasure goes forward to them, and they're making the final say on where it will end up and what the ex gratia reward will be. So it takes that pressure off of us. We're not judge and jury, we make recommendations that they ratify. So that means that museums will be able to declare an interest in acquiring the find. That's how it would make its way to museums, with any ex gratia payment then being paid by the museums and eventually going to the finder. If an item is disclaimed, if we decide that we don't need to claim it for the Crown, it's not at that level of significance, it still gets a record, so we still have that dot on the archaeological map, we've still captured the data for future research and reference, but it will go back to the finder. It's then theirs to do with as they wish. They get a certificate that says this has been disclaimed by Treasure Trove. Doesn't mean it's not an important object, it just means we can't put everything through the system, and many disclaimed objects do then work their way back into museum collections as well, which is really lovely to see. It's important to say that only accredited museums can officially apply to acquire treasure, which means they have to have to be accredited is to meet a certain set of standards by Museum Galleries Scotland. Often disclaimed finds will make their way into non-accredited museums, which is a really lovely way of more local, smaller community museums getting access to finds that the claim process doesn't always make accessible to them. So yeah, that's the broad sweep of where things go, but claim and disclaim being the two main prongs of decision making. But when we record finds, traditionally the data hasn't really gone anywhere. It's always been a bit of a weakness that what we're seeing, and theoretically we're seeing every bit of archaeology that comes out of the ground in Scotland, you know, it's an enormous and very significant data set, has been a little bit insular and hidden away in databases. That's obviously not great. So we do now have a publicly accessible database. If you go to treasuretrovescotland.co.uk, you can now access our database. It's slowly being populated, new finds that we're working on and getting added on there. We're working through in batches to get historic data cleaned and tidied up and put on there. But the idea is that going forward, this will be a place that's of real value for research to find out what's been found in your area and disclaimed or indeed claimed. So we hope it will be a proper, valuable research resource for everybody. Just an example there of the sort of records that we see. We don't put find spots online, that's the only thing, but that is available to any researchers that want it, that can apply to us. But otherwise, it's a core record to start getting information known. So with that, I will hand over to Janel.
Great. So Anthony's kind of walked you through what we do in the office on a day-to-day basis. We look at finds, we record them, we put them online, we make decisions. But we do, since we have the expanded team now, we do quite a few other things in association with that. Mainly to connect with communities and sort of get information out there. So the main thing that we do is outreach. As you know today, we give public talks. We also do workshops. So I've mentioned to some of you, we're doing workshops in North and South Uist for heritage professionals and volunteers there. We have attended rallies in the past. Metal detecting rallies can attract up to about 200 to 300 metal detectorists over several days, and they're all finding things. So we are working with rally organizers to try and make ourselves more visible, find out, how can we visit rallies to look at finds as they're coming out of the ground, how can rally organizers make our work a bit more known so that people know that they need to report things to us. We also, our most common form of outreach is finds days. We haven't done one in the Western Isles in I think about 4 or 5 years now. But typically when we do these, we come to a location, a local museum will usually host us, and then we meet with people in the area who we know are ready to hand things in to us. So they'll show up with the paperwork and the object, and that's the point at which we can start putting things through the system. We also less commonly do site visits. So occasionally there will be something like a hoard discovered, and often these are by metal detectorists, and if they realize they've found a hoard, the thing we encourage them to do is stop, immediately stop and call us. And that's when the Treasure Trove team, and usually 1 or 2 of the archaeologists from the National Museum of Scotland, because they have more fieldwork experience than we do, will come out and we will conduct a formal excavation of the site so that we can get as much information about that hoard as possible. This one down here is actually in Barfus on Lewis. We were out in November of last year. I say we, my colleague Sophie was out in the rain and wind last November because a hoard of silver Viking arm rings was discovered. And so we came out to excavate the site. My colleagues were able to identify the original hole that it had been dug into. Unfortunately, no remains of any kind of vessel or bag or anything like that, but even just getting an idea of where it was buried in the ancient landscape is hugely important for uncovering the context of it. We also do things like we will occasionally visit sites to investigate. This is a site I went to up in Murray in February. Someone had found a saddle quern, and unfortunately the saddle quern had then been buried under several tons of concrete rubble. So visiting the site was just to determine that it was no longer accessible, we could not record it. And we also do things like couriering and object retrieval occasionally. This is a very large, 6-foot-long Pictish stone that came out of a field also in Murray a few years ago. I think it's been through the system now, it's been allocated. It ended up going to the National Museum because it was too big for Eilean Museum, unfortunately. It is enormous, but it was dug out during construction work, no one knew what it was, and then someone walking by brushed the mud off and found the symbols carved on the side, at which point it was reported and we needed to move it because it was exposed to the elements, it was at risk of theft should someone have a giant crane that they could use to lift it. So that's the kind of things that we end up doing based very much on circumstances. We also increasingly are doing a bit of research. This bit in the middle is one of our typical SAFAP forms. This is the sort of research and report that we put together for every single item that gets claimed. So we spend time researching the context, the history of the find, the history of the area, and putting that together for the museums to see before they apply for objects. Increasingly, museums no longer have archaeologists on staff, so the information that we're able to provide helps inform their decisions as to whether or not they want to apply for the claimed object, and it gives them a bit of context for display and future research. So we also work collaboratively both with curators at the National Museum of Scotland because they have specialist expertise. We also work with curators at other museums and other academic specialists. For example, I've recently been in touch with someone who was a professor at the University of Oxford who specialises in Arab medieval coins because we had some come up from across Scotland and we needed to figure out how to date them. Obviously that's a highly specialised interest. So we do work with archaeological specialists from across the country, and the result of that occasionally is sometimes academic publications or more publicly accessible publications. This is one that was collaboratively done by Ella, who some of you may know. She was a past Treasure Trove employee. She's now a curator at the National Museum, and Matt Knight, who is the Bronze Age curator there. They worked together with Treasure Trove data to produce an article about miniature Bronze Age axe heads. So we'll come back to, we'll get to what you're all really interested in, which is the finds. So Anthony's going to talk about some of the nationally significant and special finds that we've had over the past few years.
I would say the shiny finds, the one I'm starting with is really not that very shiny, but it's lovely. So yes, some of these you may have heard of, some of them hopefully you will have heard of, other ones maybe not. But yeah, to start in Perthshire, the Carpoo logboat, which originally came to light in 2001 during a time of drought, where it was actually ironically a metal detectorist that found it, even though there's no metal involved, but he noticed some timbers sticking out of the low water level mud. They were investigated because he called the right people, he went out locally. The bits of radiocarbon dating that were done at that point indicated that this was a late Bronze Age logboat, potentially at that point in very, very good condition. It was monitored over the next few years until in 2006 it was determined that the condition of the boat was under threat, that the changing water levels, the shifting of the mud was potentially going to break the boat apart, so it needed to be lifted. Unfortunately, that wasn't the easiest of things to do. This is in the tidal estuary of the river. It meant that access was basically limited to a couple of hours a day over a very short period of about 7 days in the spring. It was literally that difficult to get in and get out that focus. So a huge expedition basically was presented to lift the boat. It was taken to the conservation labs at National Museum Scotland, where there was the space to do specialist conservation work. Waterlogged wood, if you haven't dealt with it, is an incredibly difficult material to work with. It's soft, it's squelchy, you can rub your hand over it and you'll just remove all of the grain surface from the wood. You can stick your finger through it in some cases. It's strange material. So it all needs to be treated. Usually, and I think this one was the same, it's polyethylene glycol PEG that basically replaces the water in the wood with this substance. So we've done basically about 6 years of conservation and analysis in the labs. Were all kind of interesting tool marks about its manufacture, evidence of wear from its working life were all discovered. So fascinating research. But then it was allocated to Perth Museum, went up there in 2012, and apart from a brief period when it came back for some secondary levels of conservation work, it's now very recently gone back on display in the brand new Perth Museum, which opened at Easter which I haven't had a chance to go to yet, and I'm very much looking forward to going to see. So that's, pride of place in their displays. In terms of the boat itself, say dates to the late Bronze Age, about 1000 BC. It is one of the best preserved Bronze Age logboats anywhere in the UK. There are a few of them out there. This is very much up there with the best of them. Felled and created from a single hollowed out oak tree trunk. The oak tree itself, the estimate was about 400 years old when it was chopped down. So a venerable tree indeed. And the act of actually splitting and hollowing it out was this huge undertaking as well. Some of the theories suggest that all of the wood was burned away, just to remove it a bit quicker. There's been a reconstruction of it made. The estimate is it would have carried about the equivalent of maybe 14 people or equivalent goods. But whether it was used for trade up and down the river, whether it was even perhaps a ferry moving people across the tidal estuary, has been a theory mooted. But clearly a significant part of its landscape and the ability to move around that landscape in the late Bronze Age. It's a very significant find that is the sort of thing people often associate with treasure and particularly treasure trove. Something very, very different. This is a Roman find from Cramond, so just northwest of Edinburgh on the banks of the Forth. I mentioned that the Carpool logboat might have been used as a ferry. This was found by a ferryman, so I'm trying to make connections. This is a Roman limestone sculpture. It's not a local stone. This is a stone that's been shipped in specifically for the purpose. Dating between the mid-2nd and early 3rd centuries. That dating is very much when the fort that exists at Cramond, where it was found, dates from. And this is basically from a very high status funerary monument. So probably somebody who was a high ranking officer at the fort has passed away in the short length of time that the fort was actually in operation, and they've been buried and had a memorial made outside the fort in this very grand style. So I say it's an imported limestone. It was carved from a single block of limestone. Whether that was done locally or it was brought in as a finished piece is something that we don't know, but the quality of craftsmanship is high. This is something that's been made by somebody who was very, very familiar with working with this kind of stone. Depicts, it's often referred to as the Cramond lion, but it is a lioness devouring this poor chap in front. This is quite a common motif in classical mythology. This is kind of representative of the cycle of life and death. I think the idea of the lion as well is that fate can strike at any time. You never know when a lioness is going to pounce on you, which is true. There are motifs of snakes around the base of the carving as well, and they have similar symbolic meanings of cycles of life and death and of the soul. So there's this whole meaning going on that would have been understandable to anybody looking at it. I think what's quite interesting with this is that the person who's being devoured is depicted very much from a Roman perspective as a barbarian figure, somebody from beyond the bounds of the empire. So I think it's quite nice to think about it in terms of somebody in the fort, another Roman official looking at it might have got all this great symbolism of life and death and rebirth and all of this. Whether somebody more locally having to deal with the fort coming up and seeing it on the outskirts may have got a very different picture as to this lion devouring somebody that was supposed to look a bit like them. And quite what that meant about the power dynamics on show. But yeah, it's a very significant find. 1997, I should have said that was found. That's actually joint ownership between Edinburgh City Museums and National Museum Scotland. But this idea of how we see cultural interactions and how material culture varies how people see things, also evident here. This is an Iron Age torque and a huge brooch, both in copper alloy, found at Muldoon, which is technically Highlands, but it's very close to the border of Murray, so it's east of Inverness, on the coast there. So the two items found together but scattered, so we think they came from the same hoard, but perhaps one that's been disturbed by the plough. Nothing else from the area has ever been found. This was 2014, but there still remains the potential that maybe there are some other bits that just haven't been come across yet. The torque itself, which you can see at the back here, so torques are neck gear, very kind of classic Iron Age neck decoration, symbols of status and power and wealth. Must have been very, very uncomfortable. We think men and women wore them, they seem to be quite egalitarian things. That one in particular is interesting. It's a style, in terms of its form, that we associate very much with southern Britain, but the decoration on it is purely northeast Scottish Iron Age. So again, there's a style coming in, but then a very local take on that style, which is interesting in terms of trade and connections. It's the brooch that's perhaps the most unusual thing here and the big standout here, though. The brooch itself is about 14 centimetres long, so it's a good 2 or 3 times larger than the normal Roman brooch that you would see, and hopefully you can see in the light. It's quite a stunning thing. It's a bit of a mishmash of everything. It's a Roman style of brooch, or I should say, it's a combination of 2 styles of Roman brooch, a trumpet brooch and a headstood brooch. The trumpet brooch gives us the huge acanthus here, and then you've got these various studs and decorations on the bow. So somebody's taking these very well-established styles of brooch and mashing them together, and then of course all the enamelling that's on the front, this beautiful red and yellow checkerboard, is very much a native Scottish style of decoration. So somebody's taking this thing, creating something that's a real amalgam of all these different styles, local and foreign, and making it on this huge scale that's probably impractical to wear. So this idea of ideas travelling, and particularly beyond the frontiers, thinking how far north of the Roman frontiers we are, Roman ideas travelling up and intermingling with local ideas and identities, and how people are expressing themselves, you know, through these sorts of objects and what they're making. So really unusual finds, but interesting for how we can think about people through these objects. That's ultimately the end purpose. Sticking in a similar vein, these are certainly some of the more famous finds that have come up in recent years. These are the Blair Drummond Talks. So Blair Drummond back into Perthshire. These were found in 1997? No, 2009, so it's confidential. 2009, dating between the 3rd and the 1st century BC. One thing that often happens with metal detecting finds, people always say that the kind of beginner metal detectorists have all of the luck. This is kind of one of those moments. The chap that found these, it wasn't only his first time going out with a metal detector, because it was. He got out of the car. He says he took 7 steps into the field, and that was the first signal that he ever had with a metal detector.
Wow.
The detector that he uses was an American brand, and apparently the little bit on it that gives you a little sense of what the clicks and whistles you're listening to might say, said he was about to find a 5-cent piece. So he was thinking this is going to be a tin can, this is going to be a Victorian penny or something. And no, he pulls out 4 gold Iron Age talks. One of the star finds in Scottish archaeology. I'm not sure he's found anything since. Maybe he retired at that point. But yeah, so what we have with the talk, so the 2 up here, this lovely twisted spiral work, they're not common, but that style is well known in Scottish and Irish talk, so they're very much a local, well-established style. The 2 fragments down here come from the same talk. That's a talk style that's really well known in southwest France. We don't really see that sort of talk up here at all. So at some point, that talk has become fragmented, and we don't know where the rest of it is, and has made its way up here to form part of this hoard. And the kind of signature find, the complete talk surviving here, is absolutely unique anywhere in the world. Nobody's ever found anything quite like it. But the workmanship on it, all this little beading filigree wire work, seems to come straight from Greco-Roman metalworking traditions. So somebody who's perhaps been trained somewhere in the Mediterranean. So why all of these different influences of talks are coming together at this particular spot to form this little hoard group is a bit of a mystery. There were follow-up excavations done at the site. It was found to be originally a boggy area. There was a circular wooden building, a roundhouse effectively, in the site, with the hoard buried kind of towards the back of that roundhouse. So we assume it was a watery place. It was probably a ritual sacred site with the roundhouse serving as some kind of shrine that this was then placed into. But we have no hugely further context than that. There's no other finds around it that were made to put it into any more context. But stunning finds for somebody who had, said, barely picked up a detector and did very well. Some significant finds are not always quite as obvious. This is a coin of David I. David I was the first Scottish monarch to mint coinage, so his coinage is already quite unusual and has a specific place in Scottish history. As you can see with the images, you can see his face on the obelisk there, with the eyes and the eyebrows, and then this huge sideways B is his crown on the top of his head. But this particular type of coin, the first coinage that he produced, used to really be thought to have been minted in Carlisle. David I kind of made aggressive moves, took over various bits of Cumbria, and he took over Carlisle, and the established mint at Carlisle he used to mint these coins. That used to be the earliest coinage we knew of. Early last year, this coin was reported to us. and it turns out this coin is minted at Edinburgh. So this rather nondescript looking coin turns out to be, at the moment, the earliest Scottish-made Scottish coin in existence. And we don't see enough coins reported to us. You think we would, they're really obvious archaeological finds, but people often think that single coin finds aren't that interesting to us. The devil really is in the detail when it comes to coins, and even the most innocuous looking thing can turn out to be of particular historic significance. So I thought I'd highlight that, but we still are making exciting new finds. The final case study from me is something that you might have heard of, the Galloway hoard. It has had its little round in the media over recent years. It's impossible to talk about star treasure finds without talking about the Galloway hoard. So this was found in 2014, had a follow-up excavation after its discovery, was allocated finally in 2017, was allocated to the National Museum of Scotland, mainly just because of the size and the complexity of the hoard that I will come to in a second. This carried an ex gratia reward of just under 2 million, a sizable amount of money to be found and paid out. But this is an assemblage of material that went into the ground in about AD 900. But what the excavations found was that the hoard was actually in two layers. There was an upper layer with an Anglo-Saxon pectoral cross that I'll show in a second, and various ingots and arm rings, and then a main deposit underneath. And the theory has been that perhaps the top layer was a decoy layer to stop anybody finding what was really underneath. They find it and then stop digging. I think it is still possible that it does represent somebody coming back who knew about the original hoard and depositing a secondary assemblage, higher up, and just didn't want to disturb what was beneath. But in either case, it shows us this complexity of what's going into the ground, and how it's been arranged is significant. People are not just digging holes and chucking stuff in willy-nilly. Sometimes they did, not always done. There's the pectoral cross with the lovely chain wrapped around it. This has got the evangelists on it. You see St Matthew highlighted here. So silver with niello, which is a silver sulfide inlaid, so this lovely black that you see on silver is niello, and then bits of gilding to pick out the details. So that was in the upper layer, that's one of the star find of the upper layer. The various ingots and arm rings that the hoard comprised were often in very good condition. Some of the arm rings, like the ones here, weren't bent at all. They were completely flat, as if they were kind of made but not actually then turned into usable objects. What's particularly interesting with them is that they had Anglo-Saxon runes on them, forming elements of people's names, 4 different names. So the idea being perhaps that this is 4 people with an ownership share of the hoard who are scratching names on to identify whose bit is which. And the little piece of folded silver here, the bit of packed silver, has the name written on it, but the name is actually squeezed in, like the T of Egbert is tiny fitted in, so showing that the inscription is being made onto the object after it's been cut and fragmented and folded. It's not the original object, it's the cut piece that's been having a name added onto it. So nice little insights into the ownership and the people perhaps underlying the hoard's deposition. The star objects though really came in the lower parts of the hoard. The silver gilt vessel you can see on the side there, which was wrapped in at least 2 layers of fabric. One of those layers was wool. The dating of the wool that's been done shows that the wool itself was at least 100 years old when the hoard went into the ground, so it was already an antique in its own right. The vessel that the work has been done, there's been various laser scanning to kind of show what's the fabric, the textile isn't going to be taken off because obviously it's part of the object, but thankfully various scanning techniques can show what's underneath. That's shown that it's probably a Sasanian vessel, which means it originated probably in modern Iran, so that's the vessel itself that's travelled quite some way across the world. Inside of it, when the lid came off, there were loads more little bundles and parcels of fabric-wrapped items as well, so a treasure trove in every sense of the word. But it included things such as Anglo-Saxon beads, bracelets such as these. This is a rattle stone, so it's like a natural flint that actually just has a loose nodule inside. So often things that don't seem to have any great intrinsic value very often, but may have operated as charms, may have been heirlooms in some way. Similarly, the dirt ball at the bottom there, a couple of dirt balls were found right at the bottom of the hoard. So simple clay, I think originally rolled into tubes and then curled up into these balls. But they have, when they've been analysed, flecks of gold inside them alongside other things. So one of the suggestions for these is that they were perhaps pilgrimage souvenirs, that somebody's been to a shrine or something and they've actually rolled this bit of muck, this bit of clay, in the ground or against a relic and rolled it up, and it's retained traces of that sacred site and then been taken away. Is a theory. But the fact that they've been placed in the vessel in the way they have suggests they were certainly bearing a notable significance. The items of jewellery that were wrapped up and inside the vessel include various brooches of a type that we don't normally see in Scotland. These plate brooches aren't common in Scotland. The face brooches with these wonderfully charismatic figures, I think I'm right in saying, are unique anywhere. They're just a completely unique style of brooch, or decoration at least. The very iconic gold bird pin has become something of a symbol of the hoard. We have the black touchstone here, this gold frame that this black stone is encased in. It does actually have clips, so it could be taken out. That, when analysed, had streaks of precious metal on it, so they think it's probably something used in the assaying of the quality of precious metals or gold, so something that had a very functional use in testing quality, but it's then been included in the assemblage within this lovely gold frame it was kept in. And then finally, just to highlight this little bundle of silk. The silk itself, a rare survival that has obviously travelled from the east, I'm not sure where the silk has come from yet. But you can see the object, this gold and rock crystal vessel here. So this is a rock crystal jar in the shape of a Corinthian column. So it's upside down, you can see it in a minute. If you can see all these little florets coming off and then flip it upside down and imagine a classical Corinthian column. That's what you have, but it's then been encased in this gold frame to create a vessel. In the Vatican collection there are examples of these rock crystal jars which are often found in the Christian catacombs in Rome, dated to about the 2nd century. So the idea is that this is a relic of that sort of time that's perhaps been then reframed, placed in this gold frame with a little drip kind of stopper at the top. It's got a very small capacity inside to hold any liquids, but so it can be used as a vessel for whatever was being held in there. The underside of it, so that the flat side here has what looks at kind of first glance just like an ornate bit of filigree, but it is this inscription, this bishop, was going to pronunciation, it's actually Huwald, I think is the pronunciation of the inscription. The Huwald is a Huwald, I think, in Janel can. I do Latin things, I don't know. So perhaps the possession of a bishop, or at least this item made by a bishop and given to somebody of high status. So a lightning tour through through some of the very high status and curious finds that have gone through Treasure Trove. But I will touch some more.
So I'm going to step in now and walk through some finds which I'm sure some of you in the room know very well already, but for those of you who don't, we'll give you a crash course in some of the star finds from the Western Isles. So this is, to start off with, this is the Neolithic axe that was found in Schulesheder. I'm very sorry if I mispronounce anything, please correct me. So because it was dug out of a peat bog, it is almost completely intact, and it is about 5,000 years old, 4,000 to 5,000 years old. And so it has the wooden handle with the inserted stone axe head here. You may have seen a similar one in our handling collection earlier if you were in. The axe head itself is believed to be made from porcelainite, and it's believed to actually come from County Antrim in Ireland. So this really does an excellent job of attesting the maritime connections that were already in place 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in the islands, and that for those of us, I spent my first 7 years in the UK in London, which gives you a perspective on how I see Britain. But just very clearly pointing out that actually areas like the northwest of Scotland, the islands, they were the center of the universe and this part of the world. This went through treasure. This was discovered in 1982, and it was at the time it was allocated to the National Museum of Scotland. Again, because the 1980s was before we get into that period of increased local allocation. The haft is actually decorated as well. You can't see it very well in the photos, but you can see some of the tool marks used to kind of carve it out. We also have this Bronze Age sword, very similar to the replica that we had on the table earlier, was dug out of the peat in Ayr, so you can see it still has the complete wooden handle, which is intact. It's shrunk a bit because of the acidity of the peat and the way that it works with moisture in the wood. And again, this came out of the peat in the late 1800s, 1892. And so again, at the time, it was sent to the National Collection. You're going to hear a theme as I go through some of these, that unfortunately, the most beautiful objects from the Western Isles, because of the time that they came up, are not currently in the Western Isles, but they do come back on loan. I believe this sword was back recently doing a tour. So it's wonderful that these things can still come back to be seen by the people who live in the places where these were found. There's also this beautiful Vendel mount. This one I particularly love. I'm an early medievalist, and this is one of the earliest pieces of Viking Age metalwork found in Scotland, if not Britain. So it was found in the early 2000s, and it's called a Vendel mount because the Vendel period in Scandinavia is equivalent to the Scandinavian Iron Age. It's just before the Viking period. So you have this early style, there's little animal heads here, and this sort of interlaced ribbon work with the leaves and decoration. It's a very early style, and so it likely came over on the clothing or belt or purse of a very early Viking raider or settler and got lost. Yes?
And we've seen it in Kinloch Museum for the next few months.
Excellent, yes! If you're here for a while, go to Kinloch Museum where it's currently on loan. Thank you for bringing that into it, that's fantastic. It's a beautiful little piece, and again, it's something that if you saw it come out of the ground covered in mud, you might not immediately think that it's significant or treasure, but it is actually one of the most important pieces of Viking Age metalwork in Scotland. We also have perhaps one of the weirder treasure trove cases. So this is clothing from the early 1700s, which was actually associated with a bog body that was dug out of Arnish Moor. And I will say, we don't normally process things like these in Treasure Trove these days, because the person was still wearing them. So I don't think we would consider that to be ownerless property. But this was done a few times in the 20th century, that clothing from bog bodies was processed separately from the human remains as treasure trove. Shetland Museum has a full set of clothing on display that was a past treasure trove case. So it's a really interesting example of the way that treasure trove processes have changed over time, and how kind of sometimes, unfortunately, the vagaries of common law can lead to different interpretations of this. As I said, we would not normally process this these days. It would be considered part of the burial of the person, and so not ownerless, and really not something that should be separated from human remains.
I can make the point that will be on show next year in Kinloch Historical.
Excellent. So when we're back next year, we'll bring this up again. Fantastic. So these are kind of things that have been found through the decades, if not the last 150 years, from the Western Isles. A lot of them, again, the earlier ones that came up have been allocated to them, or were allocated or co-opted, shall we say, by the National Museum, what's now the National Museum of Scotland. But you can see a number of treasure trove finds that have come through that are now here at Museum Eilean. These are ones that are in the display cases in the gallery. You can go and have a look at them. This beautiful enameled mount is believed to be early medieval Viking Age, could be earlier than Viking Age, possibly 8th century, possibly manufactured in Ireland. It's a mount, it probably sat on someone's belt or a sword scabbard as a decorative mount. We also have another Iron Age copper alloy mount with a beautiful spiral decoration, and these are actually from a Viking Age cemetery that was excavated at Leap. There were several different excavations, there were several chance finds that came from that area, but I'd like to point this out just because it highlights that actually Treasure Trove, we do also process archaeological excavation assemblages. We don't handle them personally, we don't deal with the post-ex cleaning and conservation, but ultimately when those are published and ready, we call it museum ready, they do submit the paperwork through us and they are allocated by SAFAP to museums. So essentially, not only do we deal with chance finds in Scotland, but we are actually the only body that is processing all archaeological material that comes through the country. And so that allows accredited museums to acquire not only sort of the chance finds or metal detecting finds, but also professionally excavated assemblages that have had publications and research done on them. And so I just wanted to quickly go into a few more recent finds which have not yet been allocated, but which will be going through the SAFAP process in coming years. People at accredited museums, take your notepad out, jot down your shopping list. So the first one is, these are Chris Murray's Neolithic pottery finds. Chris was in earlier, and it was great to meet him. So Chris has been pulling Neolithic pottery out of Scottish or Lewisian locks for the past 15 years or so. And his work, along with some help from from Mark Elliott, who used to be the conservator here, has pretty much redated Scottish Crannog sites by several thousand years. They are much older than was previously thought. They are actually Neolithic sites. They are not Bronze Age or Iron Age. They date back quite far, and the reason we know that is because of these beautiful pieces of pottery that have been found. Neolithic pottery in the Western Isles is stunning. It doesn't look like this anywhere else. It's absolutely beautiful. We don't often see things like this elsewhere. And so you can see it's all beautifully decorated. This is an Unstoneware bowl. I hadn't heard this, but Chris was telling me earlier that when the lipids analysis was done on it, it was found to have milk and oats, so it was someone's porridge bowl. So this is actually, these are currently being processed and catalogued. They are also being published as part of a large university-led research project that has happened because Chris has turned up these pottery that dates back or basically rewrites the history of the Neolithic in Scotland. So keep an eye out for these coming soon to your museum. We've also had some more recently. We've had these from North Uist. These are some really lovely items that were picked up in the 1950s and 60s and passed around through various hands before ultimately ending up at Takersova, who passed them on to us. And so there are two what are called frustum-headed pins. They are late medieval. We believe that they date between 1000 and 1500. They are thought to also be a Hebridean type of pin from the late Norse period or the medieval period here. So it's really exciting to find these here, where they were most likely being made and dispersed from to other parts of the Highland and the mainlands. This is also not, first glance, not very exciting. It's a late medieval strap end. So this little rivet here would have been punched through a leather strip, so it was just this shiny decorative little bangle that went on the end of your belt. It's actually teeny tiny, it's only about this big, but it is a late medieval find. We know from the type that it can be dated to about 1500 to 1600, which is a date range for which we do not commonly see objects in this part of the world. So it's very exciting to actually have this come in. It helps us better understand how communities were operating, trading, dressing themselves at a period for when we don't have a lot of information currently. We also have these finds that have come up from South Uist. They are very much a Viking Age set of finds. I absolutely love them. I got to process these a couple months ago. I was very excited. So you have very typical Viking Age finds. This is a silver dirham. It was minted probably in Baghdad in the 900s. We get these in Scotland because of the Viking trade networks. They extended from the British Isles through through to Scandinavia, down across the Baltic, through Russian river systems, all the way down to the Caspian, where they traded with traders from the Islamic Caliphate, principally wood, fur, and slaves. So we have coins, a mix of coins from the site. This is a late medieval coin, but we've also got a very early coin from the Duchy of Normandy, minted in the late 10th century, which there's hardly any of these found in Scotland. It's the only one that I know of. And then we also have half of a penny that was minted in York while it was under Viking rule. So it's a raven type penny. We've got the head of a pin of a type that's normally only seen in Ireland or in areas of very early Viking settlement in Western Scotland. There's also something a bit more unusual for the context of the site. This is the end of a Pictish penannular brooch. So it's a little brooch that would sit like this. They had decorated ends, and these actually predate Viking settlement. So the thought is that someone picked this up by trade, they found it, whatever, maybe it was a family heirloom, and someone of Scandinavian descent ended up with it. And it seems to have been potentially broken up, possibly for reuse. You could melt the metal down and use it for something else. So this actually is very early, and it's an important indicator of early Viking Age settlement in the Western Isles. This one was a bit more unusual. It took quite a bit of research to figure out what it was. The metal detectorist who found it also was able to help identify it. It's actually what we think, the cap on the handle of a knife. So there's a whole class of these objects which have been identified in England. They're recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme. Some of them, you can see this has a solid top with a hole where a rivet or a pin would have punched through to the handle. And then it's got these hollow prongs down the side. Some of them are, this is empty, it's a void on the top, so it would have slotted around a sword handle. And so we think that because this has a cap, it would have sat on a much smaller object, a knife, a dagger. So this was probably quite part of a prized object at the time that it was in use. And I mentioned earlier that we were out excavating, my poor colleague Sophie, getting blown to bits on the Macker in November, excavating a hoard of Viking arm rings. It's 3 silver arm rings that were excavated. They've been examined by a specialist in Viking Age metalwork, and he believes that they date to the late 9th or early 10th century. So the very early period of Viking actual settlement, not just raiding, but actual coming here to live. So there's 3 different types. There's this beautiful stamped arm ring, there's a more standard penannular ring, and then there's a beautiful Irish style wire twisted one. And on ones like this one on the edges, there's lots of dents and scratches, and some of those would have been from where the silver was tested for purity. The Viking economy was very much metal-based, so they didn't particularly use coinage because the coins had intrinsic value, not like we use coins today. They used it for the value of the metal. So wearing an arm ring like this was a bit like strapping a 100-pound note to your arm. So you could cut it into pieces to pay for smaller objects, you could trade it, you could bury it as basically your life savings, and chances are, we haven't done any analysis on this yet, but if we are able to do something called XRF testing, which will tell us the composition of the metal, I am almost certain that it will be made of the same metal as that silver dirham. Usually these are made from melted down Islamic coins. So it really goes to show you the trade networks of the period, the connectivity, and just how well integrated into the known world these islands were. So that's sort of the thing, what we're going to leave you on. One last thing we wanted to mention today, though, is as Anthony brought up at the beginning, we are entering a new phase of Treasure Trove. The KLTR review is ongoing, and this is the first review of Treasure Trove processes in 20 years. So we are hoping to make Treasure Trove more stable, more future-proof, improve things like documentation, public access to our data, enabling streamlining of the process so that we can process things faster, get things back to Finder, get special finds into museums. The best way that we can make all of that happen is through public input. There's a public consultation that is ongoing until the 13th, so next week? Next week, yes. So there's a QR code here or a website. I don't know why I put that on the PowerPoint, you can't click on it. But if you are interested and you would like to provide your feedback, please do, because we want as much honest input, and I'm not just saying that, we want honest input. We know that Treasure Trove has had difficult relationships in the past, and for whatever reason, and so the more people who tell us what needs to be fixed about the system, the more likely it is that it will be fixed. So we will leave you with that. Thank you so much for coming to listen to our talk today, and if you have any questions, we're more than happy to talk about it with you all, and thank you.